Welcome to S4, Paul.
Thank you, Dale.
When I read on LinkedIn that Paul had recently left his role as Chief Product Officer with Honeywell, I immediately reached out to him because there's nothing better than talking to an ex something. You know, they can be a little more candid. They're not quite as tied up. And this is not going to be a Honeywell praise or bashing session, but we're going to talk about vendors, ICS vendors like Honeywell, Siemens, Rockwell, Emerson, all those. We're going to talk about integrators and asset owners and where we've seen progress over the last couple of years, where we've seen failure, what we need to do. So maybe as a starting point, Paul, who did you interact with in your previous role?
Sure. So first of all, I'll say Dale reached out to me within 10 minutes of me posting on LinkedIn. I was quite honored to get the invitation. Thank you, Dale. So in my role as Chief Product Officer at Honeywell, we interacted with pretty much everybody. So my teams were responsible for putting together the products and service that were used to secure Honeywell customers' systems, both on the industrial side and the building automation side. So we interacted with customers, obviously, on both the IT and the OT side. We interacted with several partners, either people who wanted to sell their product through Honeywell or people that we were already reselling, like firewall vendors and things like that. We obviously interacted as well with internal teams as well. So there were the cybersecurity group, at least when I was there, was kind of an independent thing. So we did a lot of interaction with the people who were building Experian, the people who were building EBI and the building automation, as well as our internal product security group, the people who were responsible for making sure that all of the products with Honeywell were shipped out in a secure manner. And then finally, integrators. We dealt with integrators, especially on a regional level. Honeywell had a lot of direct customers, but we certainly did use integrators, especially on the building side, but on the industrial side as well, in places like the Middle East and other regions like that.
Okay. It's a good overview, so pretty much everyone, all three categories. Right. Let's start with the positive. So if you were with an ICS vendor, I'm sure you watched what your competitors were doing Sure. and kind of judged where they were better and not so good. What were some of the big improvements you saw from ICS vendor? Let's talk about product and system offerings first, not consulting, but product and system offerings. What improvements did you see over the last 1 to 3 years?
So one of the biggest leaps really had to do with things like having a secure by design philosophy, having products that are built with security in mind rather than as an afterthought. I saw a lot of progress in things like vulnerability disclosure. Whereas in the past there would be a reluctance to disclose vulnerabilities and things like that. I saw a great improvement in that as well. And I think one of the biggest things about vendors is that they have really good relationships with their customers. Very tight relationships that date back, oftentimes decades. So the reason that these ICS vendors were doing these things a lot of times had to do because customers were asking for it and demanding it.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that. The secure deployment guides are something that are available, and that started even more than 3 years ago. We started to see that maybe in the late teens. We started to see a lot of those. What though was what was the asset owner reaction to those? So now they have this great thing that the vendors put out. What did they do with it?
So it would vary, and some of the factors would be with the asset owners, how global their strategy for cybersecurity was. So if there was a group that was really pushing down standards and enforcing those standards, and maybe had some auditors coming in and making sure those standards were in place, it was received pretty well. In other cases, not so much. Cybersecurity and usability oftentimes do not go hand in hand. So when you deploy a system that was in a more secure configuration by default, a lot of times you couldn't do some of the shortcuts and the tricks you used to do in the previous one. So we would see instances where secure settings would get rolled back for the purposes of usability.
Yeah, I know when I would go out, and this was a common occurrence, you'd go out to a site and they would have it deployed in the default the same way they had been deploying it years and years. And sometimes it was the vendor who deployed it, sometimes it was the integrator.
Yeah.
And then you could actually pull out the secure deployment guide and you could say, this is how, Honeywell or Rockwell or whoever says this is how we should deploy. So that was a positive.
Right.
Do you have any idea like what percentage of asset owners actually followed that? I mean, are we at ballpark, even
I would ballpark, in terms of the initial deployment, I would say the majority.
Really?
The majority in the initial deployment, there would be some requirements, but it would get, it's like anything, the plan never survives contact with the enemy. So once you're going through a newly migrated system or you're going through a newly deployed system, as you start to see how it works and what you can and cannot do, that's where you'd see things start to get rolled back. So it would be deployed securely initially, but it may not last a week.
And are you talking about more the DCS type of systems here?
Mainly DCS, yeah.
Okay.
Mainly DCS.
Yeah, I could see a higher penetration with that, maybe.
Yeah.
And were you seeing the same things with your competitors in terms of they were putting out secure deployment guides, they were getting put
Yeah, I think from a competitive standpoint, I actually went and took a look at some of the competitors right before I talked today, just to kind of see what they were up to. And definitely, you see competitors with the secure deployment guides, a lot of services and things like that. So it's at very minimum a section on a website, and there are services that you can buy to help with those deployments.
What about ICS vendors and security features? So, for example, embedded firewalls or secure communication, secure authenticated communication between HMIs and controllers or things like that. Are you seeing those get integrated into the ICS products?
I would say yes, probably a little bit more slowly than I would expect. Certainly I think there are options for turning on encryption and doing things like that. I think the big thing is it takes so long for these systems to get upgraded and deployed and things like that. So if you look what's actually out there running, the vast majority of them, I would say, do not have those features enabled.
But are you seeing vendors say, we need to have these features? Like, are you seeing almost a spec sheet kind of competition between where you were and your competition that, okay, we've got an embedded firewall, we've got endpoint detection, we've got all these different things. Are you seeing that?
Certainly driven by customers, yes, and a bigger variety than we've had in the past as well. So I mean, for instance, of a vendor, they said we're going to use McAfee or Trellix. This is our AV standard. We certainly ran into situations at Honeywell, and I'm sure our competitors ran into this as well, where you go to a customer and they say, we're a big Defender shop. We're not going to use McAfee. We're not going to have this one thing off to the side that's different than everything else. So there definitely is more of a demand, and I think vendors are adapting to the fact that the cybersecurity world's a pretty big world. There are a lot of different vendors that solve a lot of different problems, and it's becoming harder and harder to say, hey, we only support this one thing.
It's funny because that's a little bit different than what I've run into, but again, it could be more of a DCS issue. I would say in the first decade in the teens, I found that the vendors really weren't offering secure solutions. So as an asset owner, it's like, what do I do? These are my choices. I have no choice. But we were seeing even with like SIP security and Modbus secure, that now you actually have encrypted, authenticated options. You have to deploy a certificate infrastructure in these.
Yeah.
And I've had not on the record conversations, but off the record conversations with some people that say the pickup of that is not even 10%.
Not even 10%.
On the new systems going out there.
Yeah.
So I wonder about that. And what are you seeing in terms of asset owner willingness to pay money for security? So if the DCS costs X, are they willing to pay 10% of X, 5%, 25%?
So it's going to vary, and I think from a asset owner perspective, asset owners should demand from vendors a secure system and a securable system. So a system that comes out of the box with a secure configuration, regardless of whether you tweak it, but also a system that could be adapted for ongoing monitoring and things like that. So we're definitely seeing more customers in their RFPs have big lists of things that we have to have. Now, when it comes to the external, so like the products that are going to monitor the network and things that just aren't inherent to the DCS, those are add-ons. Those are typically add-ons. And customers, from what I've seen, aren't generally demanding that for free. In terms of a percentage, it would vary, but I'd say 10 to 15% was probably about an average. If I'm paying $1 million for my DCS system, then another 100,000 or so for the products, and then some services probably on top of that as well, one-time type services.
That would be in line with what the financial community used to pay. It was about 10% you could get them to pay. I haven't seen the average asset owner willing to pay 10% of a, if you're talking about let's say a $30 million project, I haven't seen them willing to spend $3 million on cybersecurity?
I think it depends on where the budget comes from. So if it's coming from the deployment of the new asset, then yeah, there's probably, and even vendors will, in order to win deals, I mean, they'll cut things out to make sure that they're price competitive.
Yeah.
If the budget's coming from more of a centralized group and is not going to hit that of the asset owner, then I think that's where you'll see some bigger spends.
And do you see it in the future? Do you see it being a line item, security being a line item, or something that's they try to integrate into the price?
I think it's going to vary. Because there's so many different variations of how people deploy their security programs. So for a kind of smaller type of deployment, everything's compact. They're really looking to the vendor to do everything, including the security. I think you will see the line item in that case. In other cases where it's a larger company, they already have a vendor in place as their standard. Maybe they're even an investor in that vendor, so that standard is not going to change. I think it'll be outside of the scope of the actual project itself.
Let's flip it now. So you talked about some progress over the last 1 to 3 years. If you look back 3 years, what were you hoping that we would have been doing that we're not doing from a vendor standpoint today?
So I think there is still kind of a love-hate relationship with many vendors and cybersecurity, because when you look at the vendors, they're not primarily security vendors. They're DCS vendors, or they're ICS vendors, or they're building automation vendors. That's where they make their money, and that's their main line of business. Cybersecurity is typically kind of an add-on on top of that, and there has been, I don't know if animosity is the right word, but there certainly has been friction between people who are doing innovative things, creating good products that solve security problems, and integrating that into a system that maybe never originally thought of that, if it was deployed 10, 15 years ago, things like that. So I think that from a vendor perspective, I think there is a multi-million-dollar opportunity per vendor in certifications, where security companies would come to a vendor and say, hey, we want to certify our solution in your lab. We'll pay you $1 million a year, whatever the number might be, to get that stamp of approval. And it just hasn't happened. I kind of expected that would have picked up, especially in the past couple of years, but it just hasn't.
Well, let's deviate and talk a little bit about that, because we have now the Cyber Resilience Act in Europe, which is, you left right before you had to do too much work on that, but you must have been thinking about it.
They made a video of me talking about it, so it's on the Honeywell website somewhere.
Honeywell is a multinational company,
right.
Obviously sells in Europe, as do most of the vendors here, whether they be ICS vendors or ICS security vendors. That's one certification that you're probably not going to have a choice on.
Right.
But how is a vendor supposed to deal with, you have this one, maybe there's one for the United States, one for Singapore, one for China, one for what are you doing to approach that? I
think a lot of the regulations, like you say, are localized. And I think that's where you have to have a base level of certification for your products themselves. I think when it comes to the actual implementation and all the other things that you do in implementation time versus build time, that's where a lot of integrators come in. So if you look at integrators in Europe, they're probably very well versed on the new acts that are coming out, and they can help fill that gap with that local knowledge to address the customer's certification needs.
What about, just one more certification thing, what about the 62443 certifications? Is that something that, because that was in the lead, that was like one of the first ones available in this space. Do you see that as being something that vendors are going to want to or have to get?
I think it's happening now, and I know that just based on RFPs we would get and requirements that we would get, 62443 and certain sections of 62443 would be called out. I'm not an expert on that certification, so I don't know what's involved in actually taking a product through that certification, but I know that from the perspective of our capabilities, we would call out, hey, for this section of 62443, this is how that product helps you meet that need.
Okay. Let's go back in time a little bit now. So we've got these brand new systems that may be getting security features, maybe separately priced at up to 10%, maybe bundled in. And then we have all these legacy systems.
Yeah.
And this is a very old topic to this audience, legacy systems. And I was shocked, like I saw Siemens announce a month or so ago that they were going to support one of their mainline products through 2040.
Oh, wow.
So
wow.
I thought we might be shortening our life cycles, but if you're going to support products through 2040 that are insecure by design, then we're going to have these issues for a long time. Do you see vendors needing to retrofit those, or is this something where we're going to almost have two different worlds where we say, before this date, you live with it, after this date, you have some choices, or do you think that they're going to be forced to try to come up with some security stopgap for the old stuff?
I think they're going to be forced to come up with something for the old stuff, unless you have a completely air-gapped environment, which I think is not as common as people might think. But it may involve we have to upgrade these switches a little bit earlier because they have a tap capability. It may involve some other types of things. But I do think that there are some vendors out there who have this specific problem in mind, and they're building appliances, other types of things that are designed to lay on top of the older hardware that's already out there and provide some value on top.
And you must have had discussions like these within the vendor meeting saying, why are we still supporting this thing? This new one is so much better, it's costing us so much. Is it really just that much of a fear that you're going to lose clients if you move?
It's really, a lot of cases it's driven by the client, where they have this capital asset that they have had for a number of years. It's working fine. They may have not had a breach yet. And that was a big point. If they've had a breach, they're much more likely to say, hey, how do I upgrade versus,
okay.
Yeah. So, yeah. But yeah, we've definitely had, I came from the IT world before I moved to Honeywell, and 5 years was a really long time for somebody to be out in the IT world. So you're talking up to 2040, I don't know how they're getting hardware for that long.
Yeah, I thought we were shortening it up to, maybe 10, 15 years from 20, 30 years,
sure.
But it doesn't appear to be that way.
Wow.
Let's talk about integrators. So we talked about the vendors. A lot of these systems get put in by integrators. Mm-hmm. Who have been doing it for years and years. And I've seen sometimes there would be this disconnect where the vendor says do this, the asset owner might want this, and the integrator does it the same way they've been doing it for years. Does the vendor worry about that, or does the vendor say that's an asset owner issue?
The way integrators are interesting because they have the ability to push on both sides. They sit in between the customer and the vendor, the DCS vendor, and it really kind of depends on how the integrators are stocked, because a lot of times the integrators come from the DCS vendor and they've just stood up their own the integration thing. So I think especially in places like the Middle East, where we've seen probably some of the more advanced cybersecurity programs in place, the integrators were a key component of pushing both sides and saying, hey, we need to include this capability, and Honeywell or whomever the vendor is, we need you to be able to support this and things like that. In other cases, like I say, it's really just going to depend on the integrator's focus is, and if they're kind of a integrator that's been around for a long time doing the things the same way, I will say from a DCS vendor we probably like that, but you'll kind of get what you've always gotten.
Yeah, I almost wonder if that 10% number you said, if that 10% fell to the integrator as well, they might be more interested in doing security. It's like, oh, this is another add-on, we can charge 10% more.
Yeah.
I have seen cases of it, but I haven't seen a lot of cases of it.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And obviously, the cases I saw were really more where they wanted the cybersecurity, but there were many where that just wasn't a part of the discussion. I think again it comes back to price sensitivity and just an understanding of cybersecurity as a whole. Because it's not necessarily the same person, an integrator who's been implementing DCS systems for 20 years is going to also be an expert in cybersecurity. So you're talking about hiring new people, getting new certifications and things like that. It could and likely will pay off in the long run, but it's definitely an upfront investment.
So I know, because I've seen it work, there have been cases where project starts, asset owner puts in requirements. So they put in security requirements. Those requirements are tested at factory acceptance testing, site acceptance testing. It's just another feature in the system. But if you don't do that, what should the asset owner expect? Is there some minimum level they should expect from the integrator or vendor, or is it appropriate for those people just to say, well, you didn't ask for it, so you're not getting it?
I don't think it's appropriate to say that, and I think it potentially opens up the vendors to liability by doing that. I think that they're, at very minimum, you should have a configuration that's pretty close to the security guidelines that the vendor is putting out. Like that should be a non-negotiable. And when I was talking before about secure and securable, I think there also should be ways to hook in, get telemetry, get config data, get if your AV is up to date, your patch levels, things like that, out of the system that should not be an add-on. That should be something that the vendors just do by default, and it should be well documented, easy to understand, and something that an asset owner can pick up if they're really going to do kind of that bare minimum.
Yeah, I'd like to see that. I haven't seen that. I mean, I've seen many cases where system gets deployed insecurely.
Yeah.
And they bring in someone in this audience to take a look at it, and they find a problem, and they present those problems. They say, well, you didn't ask for that in the contract.
Yeah, that's a challenge.
So yeah, I don't know how that'll sort out, because to date I would be very worried if I was an asset owner and I didn't have those requirements in the contract.
And I think it goes back to needing to have those requirements explicitly spelled out and be part of that. And customers or asset owners are getting more mature in that aspect. So certainly, when I started at Honeywell in 2020, we would see it occasionally. When I left at the end of last year, it was very common for us to see those security requirements. And again, many times they're like, we're not going to pay extra for you to deploy your system securely. You just need to do it that way. Yeah,
I do think the secure deployment guides have helped, because at least you have a leg to stand on. Yeah. Especially, not so much if it's an integrator, but if it's the vendor supplying it, then you can say, look, your own document said this is how you should do it. You didn't do it the way you recommended.
Right. Exactly.
Okay, let's shift again. Vendors have security issues. Mm-hmm. Vulnerabilities are found in all the products. No one's immune to it. Everyone has them.
Sure, fact of life, yep.
Yep, and we see it's almost like the ones that are tested more have a lot more vulnerabilities. And, you'll see sometimes a vendor will have 30 security bulletins come out in a week. Do you think this impacts the vendor at all? Like, do they suffer at all? It's hard to see how a serious security vulnerability has affected an OT or an ICS vendor to date.
In terms of like an exploit or a breach or something like that?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I will say from an internal perspective, I led, with our cybersecurity products, I led our response to that Java issue. They'd come out a couple years ago, right around Christmas. And definitely was a painful week. And it's not just the technical requirements on that particular one, Log4j, they kept shifting what the patch was, and there's, to put something out, there's legal processes and stuff like that involved. So, it's definitely painful from a vendor perspective, but it's a fact of life. You've got to do it. In terms of actual notable breaches, I'm with you. I can't really say this vulnerability was exploited that led to this loss of X millions of dollars, at least not directly.
I'm really finding myself to be a vendor apologist more and more. But if I were to look at this, if you have a breach, there is some internal cost, right, to deal with. Yeah. You have to deal with your customers, you have to track it down, issue the things, deal with the support. But we don't see really any impact on stock price.
Yeah.
I don't know, have you seen, for example, someone who is going to buy one product say, we're not going to buy that product anymore because of the breach?
I would say I've seen some pause given, but I've never seen a purchase decision actually change.
Yeah. So it's a little bit hard to see what the motivation is for the vendor, short of customer demand,
right,
and that 10% to invest a lot.
Yeah, and I think it kind of goes back to the vendors or automation vendors first, and the cybersecurity stuff is added on top, and all the things that go along with that. But ultimately, if you have a good DCS that the customer has used for 25 years, I've got people trained on it, they're happy with it, and they're just going to the next version, that's probably going to win out over whether or not you've had a recent breach or disclosure or things like that.
Well, that's a good place to pivot here. So in the DCS world, where they're buying a whole system, do you think that most of the, crystal ball, like 3 to 5 years from now, not so long, but 3 to 5 years, do you think most of the security will be bought from the vendors, the ICS vendors? So they will pick the solutions and they will be put in, or will they allow the asset owners to say, no, we like this network infrastructure? Because this has always been a little bit of a battle up till now. Where do you see that battle going?
So I don't see any major changes in the way that the DCSs are sold themselves. So that includes the networking infrastructure, the hardware, all the other different types of things that go on that. In terms of who actually deploys and gets the money for the cybersecurity part. I think it's really going to depend on how closely that customer is either working directly with the vendor or working with an integrator. So I think customers will look to vendors because they trust the vendors. The vendors are oftentimes have people on site all the time, even resident people. So they're going to trust the vendors to do the cybersecurity deployments. And I think hopefully vendors are going to view that as an opportunity for themselves. In other cases, maybe one of the system integrators or someone like that, they're the ones who are going to have that customer's trust, and they're the ones who are going to do the cyber deployment.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a battle for years where certain asset owners, let's say I want to use this network infrastructure equipment, and the
Sure, yeah.
DCS vendor said, no, that'll void the warranty, or we want to put
and
this whitelisting, and the DCS vendor says that'll void the warranty.
Yes.
Is that going to continue to be a battle, or do you think we're getting past that?
I think it'll continue to be a battle.
Okay.
And again, it kind of goes back to the nature of the systems because they support products that are producing such high value things for the company. So oil and gas in particular, downtime on that would be very costly. And you say, hey, I want to put in this Juniper switch rather than the Cisco switch. 99% of the time it's going to be fine. But as you say, the vendors will say, hey, this isn't part of our reference architecture, and this is your problem, not ours. Therefore, you have the liability and we don't.
Let's finish up, and this was an area you were involved with services. Mm-hmm. So Honeywell, Siemens, every vendor, Yokogawa, they all now have a services branch, a security services branch, where they're doing either managed service and sometimes more than that. Mm-hmm. That gets kind of a mixed reaction sometimes because it's a little bit like the fox watching the hen house, right? Because if there's something wrong with the product, will you really hear about it? Will the finger be pointed in the right place? Can you work with someone else's system? If I have Honeywell and these other systems, do I want Honeywell monitoring those and installing those? So you obviously did that. I mean, and it's clearly a business thrust for the ICS vendors. How do you see that shaking out in the next couple of years?
So you bring up some good points on the fox watch and the hen house. I mean, that's definitely something that we heard and actually had, say, managed services not adopted because there was that concern of, and even if it was founded or not, I mean, there was that concern of Honeywell being too close to things to, really, report bad things that may happen with Honeywell systems. I think that, over time, that's probably going to shift a bit, and it's all going to be pivoted on how closely the vendor's relationship is with that customer. So, again, a customer who is very dependent on the vendor for a lot of things, if the vendor also sells managed services, they're probably going to adopt the managed services. Bigger companies, bigger industries and things like that, they're either going to have their own team or they're going to go with somebody who's a little bit more vendor neutral is, I guess, the right word, but someone who's not also building the asset itself. It's interesting. At Honeywell, we would get business with no Honeywell systems involved for assessments and things like that for that very reason. Because they say, hey, you guys are not, you don't have a dog in this fight, so you're probably going to get.
Really?
Yeah.
That surprises me.
Yeah.
Okay. I think we're gonna leave it there since we're almost out of time. Paul was very generous. We were supposed to talk this afternoon, but I think you probably saw in the note. Unfortunately, Nancy Levison got COVID yesterday, couldn't get on the plane, so she wasn't able to be up here and give her keynote. We do have 50 copies of her book, and we will still be giving away those. She was going to sign them. We were going to have a nice book signing. She won't be here to do that, but at 2:30, we'll still be giving away copies of her book to the first 50 people that come, and that's down on the second floor on the bookstore. And maybe just one more administrative note for those of you in the room. When you come to the big party tonight, make sure you bring your badge. Because if you bring your badge, you'll walk right through. If you don't bring your badge, we'll have to check on a list, and it'll take you a longer time. So make sure you bring your badge. And with that, please join me in thanking Paul for coming to S4 and enjoy your morning break.